Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a bridge looming out of the mist. I'm going to be focusing on trying to get the perspective and the tones right. I struggle a bit with when large buildings or structures like this bridge are the main focal point. I think I'm more comfortable with painting small distant cottages or villages or maybe bridges, that sort of thing, where the surrounding countryside or something else like the sea maybe is the focus, or the sky. But here there's nowhere to hide with this bridge. It has to be right. From that point of view, I mean, the perspective has to be right. There are many different ways of painting structures like this using watercolour. I'm going to be using the loose wet in wet method, and I'm going to try and rely on the accuracy of my drawing and tonal values to sort of create the painting, if you see what I mean. I'm not intending to get too detailed, as this is an experiment. I want to just see if using like the darks and the lights will be enough to carry this misty painting and so that everything comes together and works at the end. Now I'm starting off with the wet in wet method, creating my misty background wash over my pencil drawing, where I used 1 point perspective with a ruler, and I made a horizon line. I found the vanishing point, and then I drew my converging lines out and followed those in order to try to get the bridge perspective right. To mix up this lovely neutral sort of greeny, bluey, grey brown, I've used indigo, burnt sienna and burnt umber mixed together with plenty of water and washed across my paper just very, very simply with my largest Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush. It's a size extra large. And as you could see, it covers the page really quickly until you get these lovely fresh washes. My board was at an angle of 45 degrees and the wash ran down, and once I got the wash in the position that I wanted it to be, I laid it flat and wiped any surplus water off from around the edges, so that I wouldn't cause any runbacks. Once it was laid flat, then the paint wasn't going to go anywhere and it dried as it was. And then I left it to completely dry naturally so that all those lovely diffusions and granulations could begin to happen on the page. I think sometimes if you're in a hurry and you use a hairdryer, you can sort of limit the effects that watercolour will give you. I much prefer, when I've got time, to allow my paper to dry naturally. Once dry, I can start going in with the details, and so I've mixed up a much darker mixture of those three colours to get to a sort of a browny grey black almost. And I'm putting in my shadows. And my shadows on the piers of the bridge are the most important. The idea of the bridge rising out of a misty river and sort of rising out of the mist in the distance is really important in order for this painting to succeed. So what I have to do is make sure that I get my shadows really dark in the foreground parts of the bridge and in the upper area, and as the paint comes down the piers of the bridge, I'm going to use a small squirrel mop and try and soften back, just using it clean and damp, so that I can try and get the piers of the bridge to almost sort of disappear into the water, and adding a little bit of texture to the water using a 3/4 inch flat brush, horizontally swept from side to side, to create sort of just a little bit of ripple and a little bit of reflection. It's quite tricky, and as I say, this is an experiment, And I highly recommend this sort of experimentation. If you can push yourself out of your comfort zone and try tackling things that you wouldn't normally paint, but things that you're curious to learn and that you would like to be able to include in your watercolours, even if you think they're a bit difficult for you. Because this kind of pushing yourself, as I say, out of your comfort zone and really going for it and not minding if you make mistakes or if it doesn't work first time, really will help you to progress on your watercolour journey far more rapidly, because you will learn far more by pushing yourself beyond what you normally paint than sort of painting the same old things over and over again. I mean, that can be lovely, it can be therapeutic, it can be relaxing to be able to do, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But just occasionally, if you just try something a bit different, you may surprise yourself as to the sort of different techniques and things that you learn, and some unique effects and interesting ways of working with watercolour that you discover for yourself, like happy accidents, as Bob Ross says. I mean, this painting didn't entirely work out, but there's parts of it that I'm really pleased with. There's things that happened with the mist and the water and the reflections that I wasn't too happy with. But then there are things that happened with the mist and the distant buildings that I was really pleased with. So sometimes, as I say, it's very important, if you paint without trying to produce a finished, perfect result, then you'll be far more relaxed and less stressed out when you paint. If you think to yourself, it's only a piece of paper, it doesn't really matter, it's a learning curve, then often these paintings turn out better than the ones that, well, I find that the ones I try really hard to paint, they often end up a bit dull and a bit lifeless because I've been a bit too sort of tight and careful with my painting. So getting back to the painting here, as you can see, all I'm really doing is going in and painting my sketch, my initial drawing that I took time to get the perspective right. And if I can follow that drawing and get my darkest darks in, make sure I've kept enough light across the front face of my bridge, then hopefully it should look okay. The initial wash worked well with that sort of neutral colour that was produced by mixing those three together. Burnt umber, indigo and burnt sienna, that's right, yeah. And I just got this really warm, foggy, misty colour that I like ever such a lot. If you haven't got indigo, you could use a touch of Prussian blue. That would work really well with those other two colours to give you a beautiful sort of neutral, misty sky and watercolour. Now here I'm using just the paint water really, and I'm pulling it down with the 3/4 inch Cotman Series 666 one-stroke flat brush to create my distant skyscrapers of my distant city. Just the paint water, because I want it to be really, really faint and hardly able to be seen through the mist, just to sort of add a bit of atmosphere and to balance out that side of the painting. So here you can see I've got just about all my basics in. The next thing will be to continue to work on the painting, increasing some of the tonal values here and there and adding a little bit more detail and trying to maybe bring a bit more depth to the darkness of the piers, like here, and then again trying to make sure there's a little bit of reflection in the foreground in that sort of very dull water, and a little bit of movement, which I think I'm overworking it a little bit, but I still think overall I'm happy with the way the painting turned out. And it's taught me a lot. It's taught me the next time that I try this subject, and I'll probably try this exact same bridge again and see if I can sort of try a much more minimalistic and less is more approach than this. But I wouldn't have been able to do that without first painting this prototype to start with, if you see what I mean. This is where I'm learning where the pitfalls are, what's difficult, how much paint to use, how much water to use, where to let things dry, where to colour blend on the page and allow things to be sort of painted wet on wet, which brushes to use. All those sorts of decisions I can make and experiment with in this prototype. And then when I go on and try painting a second version at some point, then I can take everything that I've learnt from painting this one into the next painting. So I think I'm nearly there. I'm not quite sure. There's a few things that I'm thinking at the time aren't quite right, but it's really difficult to see them when you're sort of in the throes of painting. Sometimes if you remove the tape, then you can look at it with fresh eyes because it almost looks like it's in a frame. And then you realise that there's certain things that you need to do. And I'm going to digress completely from the reference photograph, which has no lights. And I think my painting needs some twinkling lights. So I'm using vermilion, and I'm going to use some white opaque gouache and paint on lights, mostly showing up in the foreground, just to draw attention to the telegraph poles and all the infrastructure across the top of the bridge. I believe it's a railway bridge. I'm going to try not to overdo this, but I quite like these pops of colour against that really sort of dull but warm, neutral background. It's quite interesting because now that I've added the colour, I can sort of see other parts of the painting that just could benefit from being strengthened up a little bit more. Now here's the white, and this really pops against the dark. And I just think this adds a little bit more life to the painting. And this is where, if you are using a photograph as inspiration, you can sometimes feel sort of obliged to copy it almost exactly, but you don't have to. Use your artistic license and create something unique, something individual. Simplify the photograph, but then once the painting sort of develops a life of its own, then it'll tell you more or less what it wants. I mean, I found my painting to be quite bland, but now that I've added the vermilion and white gouache lights, I'm much happier with it. I think it actually works overall. And now that I've nearly finished with it and I'm looking at it with fresh eyes, I can see that there's a few things that I can just tweak and adjust to improve it a little bit more. A couple of my poles aren't quite vertical, and here I think I need to address that. I think fence posts and poles like that don't have to be fully vertical. They can have more character if they're at slightly different angles. But I think here everything needs to be looking a bit more vertical. So I can just use a flat brush, the tips of that, and straighten those up a little bit. And at that point, I thought I was finished. But then a few minutes later, I noticed something and I adjusted it off camera. I'm afraid I forgot to film it, but I realised I was focusing so much on my tonal values that I forgot these front facing light areas of the piers. So I just put those in with a very simple little bit of sort of mid-neutral paint, a very thin line on the nearest ones, and I think that just finishes it off. It's funny, I was so concerned about the tonal values, I'd actually forgotten about that part of the structure. But that just goes to show, doesn't it, how when you're experimenting and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, then it is difficult, it is challenging, but you can rise to the challenge and learn so much more by just sort of just experimenting and pushing yourself a bit sometimes. Well, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that will encourage you to, branch out and try something different from time to time, but without worrying about whether or not it all works or whether it doesn't. What's important is just to sort of experiment and to learn from that, and then you can put what you've learned into practice in future paintings. So thanks so much for watching. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.